when you get that thing published, I hope you'll send me an autographed copy. I'd like to read it. That sounds like a lot of good work. It's something. It sounds to me like something uh, something unusual, not just restating what others have said. I think you're kind of doing some cutting edge stuff here, so I hope you'll stay at it.
Yeah,
That's
I.
good.
Hi, and welcome to the Johnny Random Show. I am so excited to be joined today by Bruce Gore. He is a Christian author. He's authored books. He was a former professor at Whitworth College and a former lawyer as well. So, got quite in the topics that we talk about on this channel and all the things. Hopefully some great insights for us today. So, do you want to give us a little bit brief about yourself? I mean, I sort of,
Sure.
yeah, introduce yourself.
Yeah, well, I appreciate the invitation to be on your show here. I actually grew up about 100 miles from Spokane, Washington. My dad worked at Grand Coulee Dam, so that was where I had my childhood and so on. Went to Whitworth University, then it was Whitworth College in 1967. And when I graduated, I was in broadcasting for a while, Christian broadcasting, and a little bit of secular radio as well. But I eventually got into teaching at a little Bible school here in Spokane and did that for a few years. Had a bit of a friendly falling out with them over theological issues in about 1980. And so after that, I went to law school and practiced law here in Spokane, served on the adjunct faculty at Whitworth University, teaching Bible, history, ethics, related topics, new religious movements, taught a class on cults, that kind of thing. And retired about 10 years ago. And so at this point, I'm just enjoying the golden years, but it's nice to be on a program like yours and others. And so it's nice to be here. Thanks.
Yeah, and I probably should have mentioned in there you are a YouTuber. You've got a YouTube channel with lots more views, and it's likely if you clicked on this interview, you clicked on it for your because of your name rather than my show. But I'm just so thankful for your time today. So we talked, on this channel we've talked a lot about the Political Dials project, and so I wanted to just sort of briefly give a little maybe 2 minute sort of just what it is. And then go through some of the things that I think would be related to that. So, Christian Dials Project is got 5 dials, and these dials are how you're comfortable with certain topics. So the first one is the church. So, do you think that the church should have the authority to set doctrine, and you would submit to that? And at the bottom of this dial, like it's a 1 to 10 type scale, at least as it currently exists, would be that the individual should I should believe what I believe, and if the church, falls in line with that, great, but it's more on me to decide what, theology I should believe, what doctrines. So you'd find more, non-denominational churches would be lower on this dial, and of course the Catholic Church, a lot of the Orthodox churches would be higher on this. The second dial would be Scripture. So at the top of this dial would be like God dictated that to a scribe who wrote it down. It's can not contain errors. It is the infallible word of God. As you kind of move down, then maybe in the middle, it's like, okay, it's a human book and a divine book. And there's some sort of marriage here. And at the bottom would be, it's a human book. Of course, it's the word of God. It contains great things principles that we should live our life by. But as far as we should take what Jesus said very, very strongly, what maybe Paul said, and maybe what happened in the Old Testament, whatever. So that would be the scale on that. The next 3 are more functional dials. So it would be God, the dial of God, how you see God. This would fall in like soteriology, free will, Calvinism. So if you're high on the dial, you didn't have any say in your, election, or, where if you're in the bottom, it's like free will, every would be. So it's sort of functional. The fourth numbers. Fourth would be the spirit, and how we interact with the spiritual world. So if you're low on this dial, you'd be basically prayer is the only spiritual tool of warfare, and is the means and frequency is kind of the way we kind of got to on functionally how to think about it is the easiest way. So on the top of that would be speaking in tongues, prophecy,
Okay.
all the different things like that. So it's you're invited into the spiritual world, into spiritual battle,
Right.
all these things. Deliverance ministries, the whole bit with that. So and
Mhm.
then the last one would be the future, our hope, our end times, our
Okay.
eschatology. So how you think
Yeah.
about how that works. Um, and of course, a lot of the questions I sent you were kind of in that last style,
Sure.
that
Absolutely.
functional one.
Right.
And so just to that's the whole overview of it. And to me, just to give you a little bit sense about why I wanted to develop this framework to think about all of these is I went through a period. I was raised in the church. My dad preached, for a while. We were Free Will Baptist growing
Mhm.
up, and so I was, uh, you know, you grew up in a Baptist fundamental tradition. You kind of
Mhm.
think that
Right.
we have the right way, and this is how you think about
Yeah.
it, and
Sure.
maybe that's true of all
Yeah.
denominations or belief systems. But I began to you know. I guess the popular word is deconstruct. Whether I don't
Mhm.
know if people like that term or not, um, but so I started, kind of thinking about, and then I also had a period when I joined the Navy where I kind of veered away from, I kind of felt like Jonah.
Mhm.
God called me into ministry or some, to more
So you're
following
in the
Him.
Navy. Did you get swallowed by a whale along the way,
No, I
or?
didn't. I never went on
Okay.
a ship the entire time I was there. I worked in a
Well,
hospital.
thank you for your service in any event.
I appreciate that. It was a great
Yeah.
time, but I think, spiritually I was running,
Hmm.
I think from my calling, um, even though I enjoyed serving. But
Mhm.
the, when I came back, to my home in Tennessee here, I, went through a period of just wrestling with God and, and so
Mhm.
now I
Yeah.
feel very uh, called to some sort of ministry. And so part of
Great.
that is like, what do I believe? And how do I, question some things and kind of like, I've heard your, share about, eschatology being, one of the, not the only, but one of the things that caused you to,
Mhm.
shift in your mindset on what you believe
Yeah.
in and
Yeah.
everything. And for me, it wasn't so much eschatology as it was scripture, the
Mhm.
inerrancy. How do we understand this? And but within a framework of, okay, I'm gonna not worry about all these other issues and not throw the baby out with the bathwater. I'm gonna figure out where I am on this particular thing.
Right.
And I also was doing this YouTube channel and going through the political dials. I've always loved politics. One day I wanted to run for politics or
Mhm.
for political office, and so I found your channel and the historical context of the Bible, Presbyterians and
Mhm.
American history, and Revelation, all to just be extremely insightful and valuable to me.
Mhm.
So you're one of the
Great.
people that I found just extremely instructive. And I think I differ with where you come down on some of those
Okay.
in a certain way, but in other ways I absolutely appreciate. And I think
Mhm.
we're and what I found is I think we're closer, and a lot of people are closer than they think they are. And so
Mhm.
this project is about trying to cross some of those bridges
All right.
and build that framework. So, uh,
Excellent. Yeah, that sounds good. You bet.
so well, this whole thing is not about me and my journey. It's about you. When the Puritans came to America, they brought
Mhm.
their
Mhm.
postmillennialism. So did they call it postmillennialism when they came
No,
over?
I don't believe so. That's a good question, but I believe the term postmillennial and amillennial, both of those terms, were actually developed as a response to the term premillennialism. I think premillennialism was the first term that began to be bandied about in Christian circles. And so certain Christians, in order to distinguish themselves from that, used the term postmillennial or amillennial. I really can't tell you exactly the etymology of those, in other words, the historical origins of them. I'm not sure anybody can. because they just started becoming terms of art in Christian conversation along the way, and where it originated, I believe, remains a bit of a mystery. But and it doesn't matter that much. But I think the term premillennial was the first to be used as a term of art in these eschatological discussions.
But it was in response to premillennialism.
Yes, okay. Yes, and it was the of course what we call premillennialism was not an uncommon view in the second century of Christian history. Mm-hmm. And of course, people who are premillennial like to point that out and say, well, that proves that must have been the common view. I'm not sure it proves that. It does prove that the Jewish influence in the Christian world continued to be considerable. And the Jewish view, we see this even in the New Testament, was that Messiah would come and establish a political kingdom, And of course, people, when Jesus came along, were a little confused because it seemed that was the last thing he wanted to do. Even John the Baptist says, are you the guy? Or we're waiting for someone else. Come on, man, get with it. I'm sitting here languishing in jail. Why don't you, make some action? And Jesus had to readjust people's expectations that his purpose for coming was fundamentally redemptive, and that establishing any kind of political kingdom was not on the agenda. Well, the Jewish influence, Christian believers who were Jewish, continued to be a very important element, and it came to be understood, well, Jesus came the first time to do these redemptive things, to, the death and resurrection and so on, and he's going to come back pretty soon, and he's going to establish that political kingdom that we've been expecting all this time. And of course, they relied on Revelation chapter 20, which makes reference to 1,000 years. And so there were Jewish strands. The Ebionites, for example, was a Jewish movement. It was heretical, but it was fairly influential in the early 2nd century. Others that really did advance the notion of a premillennial view. Even Justin Martyr, who was certainly not a heretic. I mean, he was a solid, father of the church, but he seems to have embraced a premillennial view. By the time you get to the 3rd century, premillennialism has pretty much passed from the scene. There's still a few voices, not nearly as many, and certainly by the time Augustine comes around, born around 350 or so, premillennialism had passed pretty much from the scene, and Augustine develops what came to be called amillennialism, though he didn't call it that. Mm-hmm. He simply developed a view that the Christian movement is developing through history, growing, expanding, extending its influence, kind of like a mustard seed grows from a tiny seed to a large plant, that sort of metaphor. And so that became the dominant view, really through all the Middle Ages, through the late Middle Ages, in the Reformation. That's pretty much the view. That didn't change a lot. The methodology was disputed, but the fundamental idea was the same. In the early Puritans, there were men called the Fifth Monarchy men, and they came along and actually were the first ones, as far as I know, to reintroduce a premillennial outlook. It was certainly not the majority view. In fact, it was a tiny minority of Puritans in England that took that view, and that did cause the majority of Puritans to step back and say, hold the phone, that's not the eschatology that we actually envision. And they began to ramp up and develop a more robust notion of the growth of the kingdom, an expansion of the work of Christ, a growing influence in the world, and all of that reached its culminating expression with Jonathan Edwards and his great work on eschatology, which really did develop rather thoroughly and in some ways you would say almost ad nauseum. He went into such detail on it, advancing that. Later, premillennialism came along. This is the early 1800s. And when premillennialism was rolled out through Darby and many others, even, some of the Jehovah's Witnesses, the Mormons, and so on, even some of those groups all began about the early 1800s. That is what forced those who disagreed with that view, dispensational and others like them, And that's where the term post-millennial began to be used in the conversation. I hope that gets at your question. It's kind of a short history of that whole story.
Yeah, that's absolutely helpful, for sure, especially in my context, of the question, and the reason for asking. I also um, just I'm gonna cut this little out. My dog like knocked my stuff over,
Oh,
and so my second screen shut off. There we go. Now just get my second screen up, and I'll be ready. Um, but my I have a political dials. First, are you familiar with the political compass?
I don't believe so.
So, when I was at college at MTSU and I took a political science class, there was a test that they had us do, and I believe it was online, and it had a like questions. How do you feel about this and this and this? And it
Mhm.
more or less grouped you on a grid, and
Okay.
here was conservative and libertarian and socialist and liberal or whatever,
Okay. Yeah.
and it had like a authoritarian axis and then a economic axis, and that's what it
Right.
used to map you onto it. And I got so frustrated at the end of it, I almost pulled my hair out. I was the only libertarian in the class, but I was like, I'm seeing
Uh,
how this is asking me the question, and I know what it's asking, what I'm answering.
right.
And so I was very frustrated with it. And I just thought to myself, there's got to be a better way to understand your ideology. So my
Hmm.
political dials is also on this channel. And I think it's called Guide to, Understanding Politics or something like that. But more or less, it's 4 dials, but I've since added a fifth. And the first dial is your individual. So the rights of an individual are
Hmm.
like, if you think that you should, and it's very similar to kind of like the church versus, do you think the
Right.
government should be dictating things how it goes, or the individual? And then
Hmm.
there's the second one is legitimate government, but I think I changed the name to size of government.
Okay.
So,
Yeah.
should we have a large government that does a lot of
Right.
things, or a small government that does a little?
Right.
And then a higher power. So do you think that everybody kind of has like an outside force that they subscribe to? And this is the one I added in, whether that's science or the scientific method, or
Hmm.
whether it's God. And so there's sort of a spectrum of beliefs on there. And then the last two are social contract. So what do we do about
Hmm.
other people? you know
Right.
and then
Right.
your relationship to that. And then the last one was borders. So
Okay.
in that context, if you, depending on how you set your dials, is how I talk about it,
Hmm.
you would say, okay, you could almost have the same dials, 4 of the same dials, and be different on one, and call yourself a
Hmm.
conservative or call yourself a liberal or a libertarian, depending on which
Right.
one you put emphasis on, which one of those is the
Yeah.
most important thing to you.
Hmm.
And it kind of functions as a personality test.
Yeah.
Was how
Yeah. That's good. So
supposed to.
you came up with that on your. I mean, I know the compass.
Yeah, the
You
whole
were slow
dials.
earlier, but you sort of reinvented this thing for your own purposes. That's good. Very ingenious.
Yeah, I had to. I, I've always had this, like, I don't know if it's a curse, but like when I go to a job, like I can't function until I understand everything about the job. It's like
Yeah.
I gotta understand all of it. And then
Yeah.
so like for the first 3 months at any job, people are like, that guy's a dummy. And then after it all clicks, and I'm like seeing
Yeah.
things that other people don't see on how to do things. And
Right.
I've written SOPs for the military and in other jobs,
Hmm.
because it's just the way I have to work. So it kind of
Yeah. That's
applied to
great.
politics, and then it applied to this, on how to see and how understand Christianity. So,
Hmm.
um, boy, that was a long rabbit trail. I'm sorry about all of that, but
All
uh,
right. That's it. Yeah. That's
just
good.
so these are the two projects that I have, and hopefully eventually they'll come out as books. If I ever find
Yeah. Great.
the
Good. I
time.
hope they do.
And part of the thing, back to the Christian dials, is that you would have each individual would have a personality test, or take it, and see where they
Hmm.
fall within these. But each denomination of churches would also have settings. We
Yeah,
believe as
sure.
a church, this is how the correct things are. And so, if you could go to a website, and we were going to do an episode of this. My father usually jumps on these and helps me, and my brother-in-law and other people, get on here and try to map out. But I don't know enough about all the denominations to try to map them in here.
Right,
Um,
right.
so, but you've been invaluable on, and you actually, I have to give you a lot of credit for this, because you gave me a lot of the political dials
Mm,
information, and even helped me in you know, I think it was your whole story about, or personal testimony on understanding how eschatology impacted this pessimistic worldview. And
right,
so
exactly.
that
Yeah.
is how it's like, wow, this is a whole thing, this is a dial. So I mean, it's
Hmm.
from you is where I came into a lot of these ideas. I have to give you
Yeah,
credit
right.
for a lot of this. So um um but yeah, so in the Puritans, that's what's kind of important for both of these, because I think that in the higher power dial on the political thing, is you would have people that would, uh, I don't know exactly how this works in science. I haven't worked this one out exactly. But if you're a Christian and you believe in a higher power, well, how does that higher power work? Are you a deist?
Mhm.
Did God just disappear after here,
Right.
or does He have a mission for you on Earth to make a kingdom? His kingdom
Hmm.
here. Is
Yeah,
it physical, or is it just symbolic?
yeah.
So all
Yeah.
of these things are, on and represented in the dials, and I think also in the
Hmm.
Puritan worldview, and I think even today, um, I with the conflict in Israel, you have a lot of people saying we have to stand by Israel, no matter what, and
Right.
uh, you know, uh, might get cut out, but a little controversial. My take is like, well, we follow Israel under some of the kings that they had. I mean, we want
Yeah,
to follow Israel. David, he's a great king, but would we follow Israel into battle?
yeah,
On some of the
yeah.
other kings. It seems like just a blanket statement like that is not
Hmm.
very perceptive.
Hmm.
For
That's right.
sure.
Yeah,
Um,
that's right.
I think that the church has a confusing messaging, a confusing messaging. They are confusing in their messaging on, in terms of like the supernatural world, and we have a materialistic mindset of it has to be proven, and yet the miracle of salvation, and Jesus cast out demons, and I think a lot in the cessationist worldview,
Hmm.
there this is just my experience, kind of coming from this background, is I think
Hmm.
that there's a danger in um, being too low on the supernatural
Yeah.
dial, and and living in a supernatural, I mean, in a materialistic way, when we are very
Hmm.
so materialistic in the church, and yet we almost like say with our mouth that we believe in miracles and these things, and yet we act in our daily life like they don't exist, and that that's
Hmm.
not how God works. And we say believe the Bible, believe the Bible, believe the Bible, but we almost functionally don't. you know
Hmm.
and when people
Yeah, yeah.
question the Bible, it makes it prime real estate for people that are deconstructing. And that's my burden, is so many people in my generation just deconstruct, or they find something that's an
Hmm.
issue and don't have the context, or ever been told that it's okay to you know to look into this, and to
Hmm.
question. And somebody I really liked the way she said it. It was a God that, or a faith that can't be questioned. I'm messing up the quote. Is a faith that can't be trusted, but it's something like that.
Hmm.
If you can't
Yeah, yeah.
question
That's
it,
good.
you know.
Hmm.
Um,
Right.
so there was a question in that. Do you agree with that, or what is your take on that?
Well,
I'm a terrible interviewer.
well, you know, yeah, that's pretty wide open. I do think, I love the image in Lord of the Rings. If you've especially seen the movie, I imagine you have.
Yeah.
At a certain point, of course, Frodo puts the ring on his finger, and it's not just that he disappears, but what at the same time happens is he gains a vision. He puts on the ring, and all of a sudden he's seeing the unseen forces, that are out there. They're out there all the time, but you don't have eyes to see until you put on the ring. That's kind of, what Tolkien was developing there. And I have some sympathy with that view. I think we live in the context of what Paul calls principalities and powers, mights and dominions, unseen forces that are out there that are very much a part of reality, but they're not part of the natural reality. So I think that has to be taken seriously, and I think Christian people should be taking it seriously. However, I think we also need to bear in mind that the gospel is powerful. The gospel is the sword that comes out of the mouth of the rider on the horse, Revelation 19. That the gospel and the entrusted to the church is such a power that it beats back the gates of hell. That in some ways the gates of hell are protecting, these are defensive gates, protecting the abyss, as it's called in Revelation. The abyss stands for the place where Satan still tends to have free reign, have influence. And so you can think of our life in this world as a contest between those places that have been touched by the gospel and become places of order, of beauty, of control, under the sovereign and holy domain of God's authority, and places that are swirling in a kind of chaotic, sort of uncontrolled, confusing, almost insane state of mind. And that's really the effect of the presence of Satan. So in a given culture, for example, the American culture, just by way of illustration, there was a time in our culture when the presence of the gospel was pretty much taken for granted, even by people who didn't believe it. Everybody was influenced by the Christian message. Not everybody was a Christian, but everybody was living in a context where the cultural influences that touched their lives traced from a Christian outlook. I like Ben Franklin. To my knowledge, he never became a true Christian. I don't know. Toward the end of his life, he gave some mixed messages along those ways. But he certainly loved the Puritans. He loved the Puritans. He loved George Whitefield and these people that were solid, people that embraced the classic Christian message. Ben Franklin wanted all of the fringe benefits of the Christian faith: an orderly society, people working hard, being industrious, doing a good job, paying 100 cents on the dollar, being honest, having integrity. He wanted all of that. That's capital benefit that flows out of the Christian message. He wanted it, but he didn't want the Christian message itself. Well, a lot of people are that way. The problem is, when you begin to pull the Christian message out of a culture, then that influence, that capital benefit of the Christian message gets thinner and thinner, kind of like an eggshell, until finally it collapses. And when it collapses, you see the abyss. You see buildings being burned down. You see open, gratuitous violence. You see bricks being thrown through windows. You see people acting like rabid dogs instead of grown-up human beings. You see all of the influences of a chaotic kind of contest between God on the one hand and chaos on the other. So I believe all that's out there, but I don't want to become fixated on it and lose sight of the fact that in Christ we have authority to drive back the gates of hell. And that's what we should be doing. I don't mind deliverance ministries. I know they're out there. I'm not part of that. I don't really operate in those circles. I'm not disparaging it, but I think the more solid foundation for our Christian service is by staying close to the gospel, proclaiming it faithfully, and seeing the influence of that touch culture at every level, educationally, commercially, ecclesiastically, politically. Every aspect of human endeavor should be touched by the broad influences of the gospel, and that leads us generally in a good direction. So I don't know how close that gets to an answer to your question, but your question wasn't formed all that well, so I feel pretty good about it.
Yeah, yeah.
So
I don't call it the Johnny Random Show in irony. You know, it's not ironic. It is the Random Show for a reason. And I do. I can't apologize too much because that's just the way my brain goes. It goes.
that's quite all right. That's okay. You don't mind me giving you a little bad time, then we're in good shape here.
We're all set. And you know, something that, made me think when you were saying that is in the the post millennial world, and maybe again, I just to give you my context is I grew up in that premillennial, kind of dispensational, worldview,
Yeah.
and then I was exposed to your, I watched all of your Revelation thing, and
Okay.
I
should send you a diploma, right? You made it through.
yeah, I made it through. I think I watched all the Presbyterians in America too.
Okay, great.
As well, but I one of the things that really struck me was, this sort of already but not yet,
Yes.
concept.
Right.
And that really has informed, a lot of my hermeneutic, to a lot of things.
Yeah.
I think of examples like Isaiah 7 when, I'm going to give you a sign anyway, Ahaz, unto you a son will be born, you call his name, a virgin will give birth to a son.
Right.
In that context, you would have thought that's already,
Yeah.
that's
Sure.
happened,
And in some ways it did already.
and it did, absolutely, 100%.
Yeah.
And
Right.
so I sometimes, and then what really unlocked a lot for me was, I think it's 1 Corinthians 14, where if Paul says, if the powers of, principalities that you were mentioning earlier had known, they wouldn't have put Jesus to death. So it's not that it's not in the Bible. It's not that prophecy isn't in there, and it's not that but it's got to be, or it's made in such a way that you're not going to be able to put it together. There's no timeline you can put together. There's nothing like that you can do.
Yeah.
You can know the Bible so well that when you see it right in front of you, you know, you can, follow Jesus, and major in the majors, so to speak.
Right. Exactly.
And so that's been very, very helpful for me, and almost adopting this kind of like, I don't know, I called myself a post-millennial futurist for a while there, or like a partial preterist premillennial, I don't know if I think progressive premillennial is what I ended up landing on, but it's beside the point. But the biggest takeaway is that just trying not to ignore what's in the Bible, right? Trying not to ignore what's actually there and the history. And one of the things that, that as you were talking that, what is the kingdom? Is it physical or is it spiritual?
Yeah.
And go ahead on that.
You think about the parables of Jesus, the kingdom was the single most frequently mentioned theme in all of Jesus' ministry. His first sermon was repent for the kingdom is arriving. And of course, how many times did he liken the kingdom to this or that? The kingdom, he came, and the kingdom was his central message. The problem was people didn't know what he meant by kingdom. They had a certain preconceived idea.
Right.
And so they got confused pretty rapidly because they thought of kingdom as a political structure of some kind where Jesus would probably be the king and he'd have a crown on his head and, give orders and stuff like that. And they had an idea of the kingdom, which was really almost upside down. And that's why Jesus says the one who's great in the kingdom, he has to be like this little kid. You have to turn over your entire vision of the kingdom. The kingdom that I'm establishing starts out like a mustard seed. It's the most innocuous, tiny little, grain. You wouldn't think it would amount to anything. Stick it in the ground. Sometime in the future, it's a huge tree. Or it's like a little leaven put in a lump of dough. Well, it's just a little bit of leaven. Doesn't amount to anything. You would think it wouldn't have any influence at all. Yet give it some time, the entire lump of dough is invaded by that. The kingdom of heaven is like a guy that plants seeds. Mark tells this, he's the only one that tells it, by the way, and goes to bed. And while he's sleeping, he's utterly, out cold. The kingdom is growing on its own. The seeds are growing, life is happening, germinating out there. It's not that the farmer's so smart. All he did was plant the seeds, and by its own energy, the kingdom is growing. And all those are the kinds of things Jesus says. And to me, that's very informative. That when he talks about the kingdom, he's talking about something that doesn't look a lot like what people normally think of in terms of political machinery. But the kingdom does, at least it seems from the way Jesus describes it, and certainly the way you find it described elsewhere, becomes something that eventually touches all human life. Some people think, well, the kingdom is the church. I don't think that's quite right. The kingdom is the church is at the center of the kingdom for sure. But the church is called to have a salt and light influence in this world. When the church has, the proper influence, we should do politics better. When the church has a proper influence, we should do commercial transactions better. That's what the Puritans believe. They believe that the church isn't equal to the kingdom, but the church is, in a sense, the special ops of the kingdom. You know that term. You're a military guy. The church is kind of at the cutting edge of taking the kingdom and its influence into the world, so that every aspect of human life is touched by the kingdom, until a time comes, as Isaiah says, when the knowledge of God covers the earth as the waters cover the sea. That's why Jesus told his disciples, all authority is mine. I'm the king. I'm the uncontested, irrefutable sovereign over this whole universe. So you go make disciples of all the nations. Teach them to observe all that I commanded you. I will be with you always till the project is over. So that, to me, the kingdom is in a sense invisible, in that you don't go to the capital of the kingdom somewhere, and walk into some kind of administrative hall. It's invisible, but it's very visible when it comes to seeing the influence here and there across the board in all of these human activities and enterprises and so on. And so, postmillennialism is really simply saying that there's something happening that stands for growth and progress. Amillennialism often says the same thing. The only difference is that postmillennial people tend to say that at the end of this project, there's going to be an extended period of time, which could be called something like golden age of the growth of the kingdom. I don't use that nomenclature. I'm not comfortable with it. I do believe, however, that the kingdom is growing, that we are all in a process of contributing to the ongoing expansion of the kingdom in this world towards some great final concluding, consummating expression of it.
Yeah. How can we change minds, right? And see, how can we,
Yeah.
And maybe that's part of this. If maybe it's, to me, it's like it's not you're wrong. It's just you're not doing it the best way, right? Or understanding this the best way. What do you think could be done? I see a lot of the charismatic movement, right, is really blown up in Africa and worldwide as well. And I think that's partially in the influence of the dispensationalists coming, and evangelizing, and then they sort of take that and they end up being charismatic, just with their traditions and such. Sorry, real quick, we'll get back to that question in just a second on implications. But when you were talking about the military special forces, I thought of, if you always sit down and you go, this is what we do, this is our tactics, this is how we, and you spend 100% of your time on how we conduct warfare, but you don't take any time to look at, well, what is the enemy's tactics? What do they do? What's their plan? What's their map? And when you're talking about deliverance ministries earlier, and I absolutely see all sorts of dangers in just spending so much time on focusing on the enemy's plan, how the enemy works, how do these demons function, whatever, do we got to call their name? Like it goes to the point where you're spending if you just spent all your time on looking at the enemy, you get overwhelmed, you get depressed, you
That's
get,
right.
so
Yeah.
there has to be a proper balance. And I think you need to spend a
Yes.
lot more time on your own forces and, whatever. But
Yeah.
I think you can't, and this gets back to that question earlier. I don't think that you can neglect looking at that. I think that you do
Mhm.
that to your own peril on not understanding the enemy. But that was just an aside thought that I had. But back to the implications. So, um, how can we get some unity in the church?
Yeah.
How can we make these
Well,
bridges?
it's I know it's kind of a popular theme to talk about how disunited Christians are, and it's really, one thing you learn teaching church history, which I've taught many times over the years, is it is nothing but messy business. It is just history is messy, church history is messy. And it's an embarrassment to see how many times Christian people are kind of sniping at each other and can't get on the same page. There's really, tragedy about that. But I think that that point can be overstated to the extent that we lose touch with the fact that, in spite of all of that, the church has had a huge positive impact in history. That virtually every significant social improvement has been courtesy of the church and its influence, whether it was getting rid of gladiatorial games, whether it was campaigning against slavery, whether it was elevating the status of women, on and on. I mean, there's a wonderful book I probably mentioned in some videos, so you may recognize it. It's called Under the Influence
Hmm.
by a fellow named Alvin Schmidt.
Hmm.
And he goes through, it's a very readable book, very thorough, well documented, and he just goes through chapter by chapter and talks about all the things the church has done in spite of how dysfunctional it seems to be, building hospitals, building schools, feeding the hungry and clothing the naked, and all of these things that the church has done are really just a staggering kind of quantum of evidence that, in spite of the church's deficiencies, it has been such an extraordinary force for good. So I don't think we should apologize for it. And I don't think we should think, oh, we got to figure out how to do this better, in the sense that we haven't already done some pretty good things.
Right.
We should always be retooling our equipment and thinking of new strategies, and that's certainly appropriate. But I don't want to be too apologetic for what's already happened. We've had a wonderful, I think, quantum of evidence to say that, in spite of the church's sometimes dysfunction, it has really done a pretty good job there used to be in college a course called Western Civilization, Western Civ.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if they teach that anymore. It seems to have become a lost article. But when I went to college, that was still a required course. If you study Western Civ, you realize all that is about is really a celebration of the influence of the Christian message. Now, the prof may not acknowledge that. He may, in fact, try to ignore it. But anybody that takes a look at it with even a kind of, just slightly detached attitude toward the evidence has to admit it's the church. So it's building these cathedrals and building schools and feeding people and taking the benefits of civil society here and there around the world. It's the church that's doing it. The church created Western Civ, you might say. And so, that great heritage, I think, is something we should never lose track of in the conversation. I'm sure there's things that we can do better. I'm not a great genius on that, but I do feel like, from a historical point of view, we've done some good things, up to this point.
Sure. Yeah. I absolutely agree with you. I think if you look over history, I think that's abundantly obvious. I just, I hate it because I look at my generation specifically, and I see, I've got a lot of friends that are, and even family, that are close to me that have gone through such horrible evils, at the hand of, someone close to them. And, if you've seen the movie Sound of Freedom, it was about the sex trafficking, and, I think
Right.
2 million, kids, which is, more than slavery, ever,
Yeah.
had.
Right.
It's, and,
Yep.
and I just, the proliferation of information on the internet, and this was the subject of the previous episode, so I don't want to stay too long on this, but it it just seems like you had the Renaissance and people were able to pick up the Bible and read, and literacy,
Hmm.
shot up, and it was like questioning, like, hey, we can do this better.
Yeah.
And I feel
Yeah.
like we're almost in the information age, and we have the internet, and it's like, hey, we can do this better. And so,
Yeah.
on one front, I'm very encouraged by the opportunity and the resources at our fingertips. The fact that I could get on YouTube and you're in
Hmm.
Washington State and I'm in Tennessee. It's like I didn't have to go to the library and look at 15 books. I could watch
Yeah.
15 videos in a week or 2 weeks. And understand something and get that concept down. Just what we have at our fingertips. I think, to me, I want to capitalize on that, right?
Hmm.
But I think the enemy
Yeah,
can
exactly.
also capitalize on it as well. And I think that, we've seen that with, pornography and all these different things,
Yeah. Yeah.
and so, yeah, not to go too dark or get too, there, because, yeah, I'm sorry. I lost my train of thought there. I'll have to
Sorry, it happens to me all the time.
Yeah.
Not a problem.
um, well, did you have anything that you thought of along the way, or any closing
Well, I
thoughts?
just, I appreciated your interest in the whole story of the beginnings of the American experiment, and if you watch those videos, I made a statement early on that some people found quite shocking, that in many ways John Calvin was the inventor of America.
Uh-huh.
But it does it gets at one of those dials you were mentioning about how much authority should government have and how much should it be a populist kind of deal, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And in church history, you've got both extremes. You have a highly authoritarian approach, which you would say the Catholic Church and others would go very much in that direction. And you had a very populist approach, a kind of congregational or democratic approach, where virtually, in the extreme form of it, every person is their own congregation.
Mm-hmm.
I make up my own rules. I live by my own creed, and then I just find some generally like-minded people. And as long as I like them, I get together with them. But there's no sort of overarching authority that creates a structure for this. A very highly individualistic kind of approach. And I think part of why I was beating the drum for the Presbyterian approach is not just because I'm a Presbyterian, although that certainly plays into it, but there was an attempt that Calvin had in mind to find the benefits of each of those extremes, but avoid the perils of them.
Right.
Calvin appreciated you need authority, you need a structure, you need that, you need the kinds of things that create an orderly approach to worship, but we don't want to run the risk of giving too much authority to any one person, or too much authority to even any small group of people, because, as the old saying goes, authority corrupts, and absolute authority corrupts absolutely. I mean, it's true every day of the week.
Mm-hmm.
But Calvin also was fearful of giving too much authority to individual people, because they tend to turn into the mob. A majoritarian approach can sometimes become highly destructive, and people in the majority can do incredible damage to people who are in the minority. And so you don't want to go too far that way. And so out there, he got this whole idea of representative government, that the people should choose representatives, and those representatives should have temporary authority. They can get booted out if the people don't like the job they're doing, but while they're in office, they have the authority of the office. He really put that together as a way of doing church, and it became called Presbyterial, based on the Greek word presbyteroi, which means elder. So it's elder-oriented church government. But he also implied it's not a bad way to do political, statecraft as well. And the Puritans really picked up on that. The Puritan experiment, as it's called in England in 1640 to 1660, kind of that Puritan interregnum there, was a little bit of a misguided effort to make that happen. It didn't work out so well. The Restoration, Charles II, and so on came back in. But the spirit of that is really what was a driving force in American, political theory, and that it was that Calvinistic vision. And so when we look at our Constitution, that's exactly what we do. We have representative, people that we put in office temporarily, and they hold the office only. They have the authority only as long as they hold the office. And if we don't like the job they're doing, we boot the bums out and elect somebody else. That's a Presbyterian approach to government. Mm-hmm. I don't think it's any accident that the American Constitution has been around longer than any other constitution in the world. I'm sorry, I must have said something that just triggered my Alexa unit back there. Alexa, stop. Do you have that ever happen to you? I think somebody at Amazon's listening to our conversation.
It must be.
So anyway, that was completely off script there, but I hope that kind of makes sense. So it's kind of a balance out there in the middle. You've got true structure and authority, and yet you balance it with the true democratic principle in terms of the people finally have the voice. But it's a voice in choosing who their leaders are going to be. That's really the critical idea.
Yeah. I'm curious because after I did my political dials video, and I took a college class after that, and it brought up the House of Burgess, right? Which, in the United States, and then each state wanted to have their own House of Burgesses, right? Their representation. And
right.
They kind of traced that back to Oliver Cromwell, right? In like 1200, I believe. And so was there a strain of that even went back further? And I just wonder if there's any, what was the impetus for that, that movement?
Yeah.
If you're familiar at all or have any
insights. Yeah. Well, that. It's, Oliver Cromwell. Now he was the leader of the Puritan armies in England in the 1600s.
Oh, was I mixing my
and it was really at the same time that Oliver Cromwell was trying to implement what amounted to a Puritan vision in England that the Puritans were in America. I mean, Massachusetts Bay was 1632, so we're right in the same time frame. So you got two different programs. You got the English Puritans and the American Puritans, colonial Puritans. Mm-hmm. In England, it was probably too much too soon, and the English people couldn't really stomach it so much. In America, it had better results. But earlier than that, you had Calvin. He's in the 1500s.
Okay.
And he's in Geneva. Martin Luther precedes Calvin. But Martin Luther, while he was a genius at the point of announcing justification by faith alone, and really recovering what you'd say is the heart of the gospel message in the New Testament, never does much politically. There's practical reasons for that. He was under the protectorship of Duke Frederick, Elector of Saxony. He lived in Saxony, and the Duke, Frederick, was sympathetic to Luther and protected him politically. But Luther was in a position where he really couldn't rock the boat. If he started saying things that you would say naturally imply that we should be getting rid of our present political structure, Duke Frederick would have had a problem with that, And so Luther just kind of took a hands-off approach. I'm overstating it, but generally.
Yeah.
With Calvin, he winds up in Geneva. Geneva is an independent city-state. It's not under any particular political protection except its own internal operation. It's in Switzerland. It's generally protected by environment and otherwise, and there's a lot more of an opportunity to do something, you might say, carte blanche, from scratch. And so that's where he can kind of work out some of the political theories for which he was well known. So that's the 1500s. Mm-hmm. Before that, you've got the Catholic Church, which had become the dominant political power in the West, at least, not so much in the East, of course, but in the West. And it had been that for many years. You might say, if Augustine gave us the idea of a growing church, expanding, growing in history, the Catholic Church construed that as growing somewhat at the point of, at least metaphorically speaking, the sword. There was a great deal of political power that concentrated itself in the Catholic Church, a great deal of wealth. Even the Crusades, in some ways, while they were a mixed success, of course, tended to accrue a lot of wealth and influence to the Catholic Church. Part of the reason the Reformation happened was because of the sort of corruption that had occurred in the late Middle Ages in the Catholic Church. I'm not saying that to disparage Catholics, that most good Catholic historians agree, at that point. Mm-hmm. And so you might say the Reformation came along standing for the idea that there needs to be growth, but it needs to grow in a different way, not by simply political power, but by the power of the gospel. And so you get more of that in Luther. You certainly get more of that in Calvin. You get more of that even in the Puritans, although at certain points it's a mixed message there as well. But you kind of see that. It's two different ways of seeing this growth of the kingdom. The political growth, courtesy of the Catholic Church, didn't turn out to work too well. And so this alternative approach, beginning with the Reformation, seems to have been trying a different approach. And really America, with the idea of freedom of religion, no authoritarian religion, no established church, all of that is an expression of the notion that really the growth of the kingdom should be more a function of the freedom of Christian representatives to simply proclaim the truth of the gospel rather than imposing it at the point of a sword.
Right. Yeah, it's funny that I think that the church dial, I think that, as you had pointed out, Calvin, kind of, you gave the pros and the cons. You kind of had said that, of the authoritarian, too much authority in the church, and proposed sort of a middle ground there. And then I think of the whole Protestant Reformation on, sola scriptura, and I think of that on my scripture dial. And then I think of, Calvinism and Presbyterianism on the God dial on, how election and salvation works and soteriology and so on and so forth. And then the supernatural dial or the spirit dial, the charismatics tend to be very high on that dial, and then you have the Baptist and the dispensational that are very high on the future dial. Sure. So you kind of have all of these sort of camps of Christianity with their focus and emphasis, and agreements and disagreements. I think you find those disagreements. So I think it's interesting, even through this conversation, how it's mapped onto,
Oh yeah, absolutely. That's why I like what you suggested there. It's a great paradigm for kind of seeing all of the variables that go into this big question.
Yeah, and I think that through that paradigm, we had brainstorming sessions on each one of these, and they're long and they're, just conversation, so it's kind of, there's a lot of to sift through to get the nuggets. But one of the nuggets we came through on several of these episodes, it was trying to find building the case for being high on, any said dial and being low on it, building the best case for it. And then, that I think that when it gets to the book, when it hopefully gets to a book, it will be, there'll be plenty of criticisms in each one, you know, like, and you'll see yourself and you'll be, convicted. Am I too high on this dial or am I too low on this dial?
When you get that thing published, I hope you'll send me an autographed copy. I'd like to read it. That sounds like a lot of good work. It sounds to me like something unusual, not just restating what others have said. I think you're kind of doing some cutting edge stuff here, so I hope you'll stay at it.
Yeah, that's good. It's tough. It's novel, and anytime you have a novel concept, it's hard to sell it. But I think I try to package it in like this is a personality test, or something like that, where you can, maybe there'll be a website connected. You can go and, fill out some questions and, so you have that interest or something. So I love it. I appreciate this conversation so much, and your time. And
happy to do it.
Yeah. Would love to, get you that book someday. Hopefully it works.
Okay.
Out, so.
Sounds good.
All right. Thanks so much.
you give me, I look at you as a young man. I don't know what your actual age is, but when I'm in my mid 70s, most people look young. So, but I can't tell you how encouraging it is to me to see folks who are in their 20s and 30s, younger, kind of the next generation, thinking serious thoughts about this stuff, because it does seem to me that a lot of people aren't thinking any serious thoughts about much of anything, and I'm greatly encouraged, to hear what you're doing. So I appreciate the chance to meet you.
Yeah, I feel like I have bit off way more than I could chew. And I don't know if you ever get the chance to watch some of the brainstorming. Boy, they're rough. Just be prepared for that. Watch it on double speed or something. So if you do, but there's so much because in each dial, liturgy comes up. How do we
Yeah,
conduct a service? Baptism comes up and the question on election. And how does that
sure.
work?
Yeah, right.
All of the issues that we've ever through Christendom struggled with,
Yeah,
come out and in these conversations. So you can't say, "Oh, I'm a 7 on this dial," and that means
right.
I believe this set of beliefs. No, that just
Yeah,
means that I'm coming through this paradigm at these set
right,
of beliefs,
right,
and
right.
I can more or less get an idea. Like if you were to take the a test, assuming it came out with a test, my hope with this, the end goal would be able that I would know where you stand, or at least feel on these
Mhm.
different things, on how the world works, understand how you
Yeah.
think Christianity works, how you look at the Bible and church and the supernatural world, and I would be able to have a conversation with you, which would be way more productive.
Hmm.
And I think that we need to me, at its best, is a method of having productive conversations.
Yeah,
So
yeah. Those are in rare supply these days.
yes, yes,
So
they are. Yes, they are.